LaToya Washington believed the worst thing that could happen to her was having a husband serving a 15-year prison sentence. She was wrong. The real horror had just begun, and it was living a life of luxury just a few miles away, waiting to be discovered. LaToya, or Toya as her friends called her, moved with a practiced gentleness, her hands adjusting the pillow beneath the head of Mrs. Henderson, a 62-year-old woman whose world had been softened to a blur by cataracts and stiffened by arthritis. Mrs. Henderson was one of her favorites at the Magnolia Gardens nursing home. The nursing home itself was a sanctuary of sorts, a place of quiet, managed decline tucked away in an older, weathered part of South Atlanta, Georgia. The muted colors, the predictable daily schedule, the soft, shuffling feet of the elderly. It was a world wrapped in cotton gauze, insulated from the sharp edges of the outside. For 4 years, this had been Toya's world, a world of quiet routines, the scent of antiseptic, and the faint, constant murmur of televisions in distant rooms. It was a job that paid the bills, just barely. But more importantly, it filled the crushing silence that had taken over her life. "You're a quiet one today, sweet pea," Mrs. Henderson remarked, her voice a fragile, papery rustle. Her cloudy eyes squinted, trying to bring Toya's face into focus. "Just tired, Mrs. H. No big deal," Toya replied, forcing a brightness into her tone that felt like a foreign language on her tongue. It was a lie, of course. She was more than tired. She was hollowed out. Today was the anniversary. 5 years to the day since the police had shattered the morning calm and taken her husband, DeMarcus. 5 years since her life had been irrevocably turned upside down. The memory arrived, as it always did, not as a gentle stream, but as a tidal wave. It was all sharp angles and jarring sounds. The percussive splintering crack of the doorframe as the police forced it, the cold, metallic click of the handcuffs, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hallway that seemed to strip everything down to its ugliest form. She'd just stepped out of the shower in their small apartment, a towel wrapped tightly around her, thinking it was their neighbor. But when she opened the door, it wasn't a familiar face. It was 2 white police officers, their expressions hard, their eyes sweeping past her as if she were a piece of furniture. Her home, a place of warmth and love, had been instantly transformed into a hostile crime scene. They found DeMarcus on the couch, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, confused and startled. "DeMarcus Jones, you're under arrest for armed robbery," one of the officers announced, his voice flat and devoid of any presumption of innocence. The accusation hung in the air, so absurd it felt like a line from a movie. DeMarcus, a gentle auto mechanic who fixed cars with more care than some doctors treated patients, a man who had never even had a speeding ticket. "You've made a mistake," Toya had screamed, her voice cracking with disbelief and panic. "He was home with me all night. He couldn't have." But her words, the words of a black woman defending her black husband, evaporated into the tense air. They were weightless, meaningless. They cuffed him, his eyes locking with hers in a silent plea of terror and confusion before they led him away. The trial was a blur of systemic momentum. A grainy surveillance video from a gas station showed a man of DeMarcus's build. A handful of white witnesses, shaken and scared, pointed him out in a lineup, their certainty seemingly enough to seal his fate. The fingerprints were inconclusive, but the prosecutor painted a vivid, damning picture for the jury, that of a desperate black man turning to crime. It was a story they'd heard before, a story that was easy for them to believe. Then came the final incomprehensible blow. DeMarcus confessed. He told Toya later, through the thick glass of a visitor's booth, that he had to. He said he was protecting someone whose life would be over if they were caught again. He said he needed money to pay off a debt. He was sentenced to 15 years in the Coleman Federal Correctional Complex in Florida. His last words to her before the bailiff led him away echoed in her soul every single day. "I love you, Toya. Wait for me." She had promised she would, and she had waited. 5 long, grinding years, trapped in the chasm between the placid quiet of her current life and the violent memory of her past. Desperate for a few extra dollars, Toya took a nursing shift in a wealthy, unfamiliar neighborhood. She had no idea that this fateful trip wouldn't just lead her to a new patient, but to a confrontation with a truth more terrifying than any prison cell, the living ghost of her husband. "Toya, baby! Could you get me a glass of water, please?" Mrs. Henderson's voice was a lifeline, pulling her back from the drowning depths of her memories. "Of course, Mrs. H," Toya said, quickly wiping away a single unsolicited tear that had escaped. In the staff lounge, a small, cluttered room that always smelled faintly of stale coffee, she sank onto a worn-out couch. From the pocket of her scrubs, she pulled out a creased photograph of DeMarcus. It was from before, from the good times. His wide, infectious smile and the bright, hopeful light in his eyes had always been her anchor. She missed him with a physical ache that never subsided. Visits to the prison in Florida were rare, a luxury she could only afford a few times a year. It was a 9-hour drive, and without a car of her own, the bus journey was an expensive and draining ordeal. She meticulously set aside money from each paycheck, but it was a constant battle against the rent for her small apartment, groceries, and the endless list of necessities. And then there had been DeMarcus's mother. After his arrest, Toya had taken on the burden of her medical expenses, a quiet promise she'd made to her husband. She had cared for the woman until she'd passed away from cancer 2 years into her son's sentence, leaving Toya even more alone. She sighed, tucking the photograph back into her pocket. Time to get back to work. As her shift was ending, Emma, the head nurse, approached her while she was charting for another patient. "Toya, I need to ask a huge favor. We've got a new client on the home care program, a Mr. Harris. He just had hip surgery and needs a check-in. The thing is, he's way out in Peachtree Highlands. Can you go?" Peachtree Highlands. The name itself sounded expensive. It was one of Atlanta's newer, more exclusive suburbs, a place of sprawling houses and manicured lawns that might as well have been on another planet. Toya nodded without hesitation. Extra hours meant extra money, a lifeline she couldn't afford to refuse. "Sure, Emma, no problem." "You're a lifesaver. The address is 32 Oak Street," Emma said, handing her a folder. "Be there by 5:30. The bus ride itself was a study in contrasts. It started in the vibrant, noisy heart of her part of Atlanta, filled with the everyday sounds and faces of a working-class community. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and sizzling street food. But as the bus traveled north, the world outside the window grew quieter, greener, and more sterile. The vibrant graffiti gave way to tasteful, understated signage. The people on the street changed, their clothes more expensive, their faces less worried. Peachtree Highlands was the final destination, a place of profound, unnerving quiet. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was exclusive. It was the silence of high fences and private security. Toya, in her simple scrubs, felt like an intruder, a discordant note in a perfectly composed symphony of wealth. She walked down Oak Street, the address glowing on her phone screen. House number 32 was a gorgeous single-story home with a clean white facade and large, welcoming windows. She was just a few feet away when she saw a man emerge from the house next door, number 34. Something about his gait, the way he carried his shoulders, sent a jolt of familiarity through her. It was unsettling. Toya slowed her pace, her eyes fixed on him. The man turned to lock his door, and she saw his profile against the fading afternoon light. Her heart stopped. Then it hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Impossible. That is absolutely impossible. But it was him. It was the spitting image of DeMarcus, the same tall, solid frame, the same broad shoulders, the same distinctive tilt of his head. He was dressed in a crisp, expensive-looking shirt and dark slacks, a portrait of respectable success. Toya froze, her feet rooted to the sidewalk. He walked to a silver sedan parked in the driveway, got in, and started the engine. As he pulled out, the car swept past her, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping second, she saw his face clearly through the driver's side window. It wasn't just a resemblance. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was in this alien landscape of sterile perfection that she saw the most impossible, chaotic thing, the face of her imprisoned husband. It was DeMarcus. She'd seen a ghost in broad daylight. Her husband was in prison. She'd just seen him driving a luxury car. Was she losing her mind? A phone call to the federal penitentiary would provide an answer, but that answer would only drag her deeper into an impossible mystery. Before her conscious mind could even process the command, her legs were already moving. Toya broke into a desperate run, chasing the silver sedan as it glided down the immaculate street. "DeMarcus!" The name was a strangled cry, lost in the quiet suburban air. But the car was too fast. It turned a corner and vanished, leaving her standing in the middle of the road, gasping for breath, her lungs on fire. She had to be sure. She couldn't let this go. This wasn't a fleeting glimpse or wishful thinking. It was a visceral certainty that had shaken her to her core. She walked back toward the house the man had come from, number 34. It was even more beautiful up close, with a perfectly manicured garden and a charming stone walkway. The mailbox, a tasteful black metal box, bore the name Thompson, not Jones. Thompson. Her heart pounding, Toya crept closer, her professional nursing visit to the house next door completely forgotten. She peered through a large window into the living room. Inside, a young, beautiful woman with intricately braided hair was bouncing a small child on her hip. The scene was a perfect picture of domestic bliss. Who was she? Who was the baby? And how could DeMarcus, or his perfect double, be a part of it? Suddenly, the front door swung open. The same woman stood on the porch, the baby now nestled against her shoulder. She looked directly at Toya, her brow furrowed in a way that was both questioning and suspicious. It was a look Toya knew well, the look of someone wondering what a person like her was doing in a place like this. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but laced with an unmistakable edge of territoriality. Excuse me," Toya stammered, taking a step back. Her mind raced for a plausible excuse. "I'm looking for number 32, Mr. Harris's house." "Oh," the woman's expression softened slightly. "That's right across the street," she pointed. "Thank you," Toya mumbled, turning and walking away as quickly as she could without breaking into a run. She somehow managed to gather herself, to force her trembling hands to function, and to put on a professional face for her appointment with Mr. Harris. For the next hour she went through the motions, checking his vitals, changing his bandages, making polite conversation. But her mind was a maelstrom. All she could think about was the man who looked impossibly like her husband, living this perfect wealthy life with another woman, another family. The moment she finished with Mr. Harris, she fled. The journey home was a blur. The pristine, orderly world of Peachtree Highlands, with its bright lights and sense of impossible calm, felt a universe away from her own small, cramped apartment in the heart of the city. Her apartment, once a cozy refuge, now felt like a cage, a constant reminder of the life that had been stolen from her. It was in this claustrophobic space that she snatched her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number for the Coleman Federal Correctional Complex. After a few rings, a tired, bureaucratic voice answered. "Coleman Federal, how can I direct your call?" "Hello?" Toya said, her own voice barely a whisper. "I'd like to inquire about an inmate, DeMarcus Jones. I'm his wife, LaToya Washington." There was a pause, filled with the sterile sound of keyboard clicks. "Yes, ma'am. Inmate Jones is in our custody, serving a 15-year sentence for armed robbery. What specifically did you need to know?" Toya felt the floor drop out from under her. The calm, factual voice on the other end of the line was a stark contradiction to the impossible reality she had just witnessed. Is he there, right now? Is he physically in the prison?" "Of course, ma'am," the voice replied, with a hint of confusion. "All inmates are physically accounted for unless on medical transfer or in segregation. And inmate Jones is not on either list. According to our records, he is currently in cell block C." Toya thanked the clerk and hung up. She sat on the edge of her bed, the phone slipping from her numb fingers. Her mind was at war with itself. The prison confirmed he was there. Her eyes confirmed he was here. Both could not be true. Had she missed her husband so much that her mind had finally cracked, conjuring his image from a random stranger? No. She was sure. It was his walk, his posture, the tilt of his head. It was him. Or it was his perfect living double. And the thought of that was, somehow, even more terrifying. Torn between a confirmed fact and an impossible reality, Toya made a bold decision. She would return to the lion's den, not as a nurse's aide, but as a wife hunting for a truth so monstrous it could destroy her. Sleep was a luxury Toya couldn't afford that night. She lay in the dark, staring at the shadows on her ceiling, her mind a frantic battlefield where reality and illusion clashed. The crisp image of the man on Oak Street, confident and prosperous, was at war with the faded photograph of DeMarcus in his prison-issued jumpsuit. The firm, official voice of the prison clerk echoed in one ear, while the memory of what she had seen with her own two eyes screamed in the other. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the silver sedan gliding past, the driver's face a calm mask of indifference, a face she knew better than her own. She tried to dismantle the impossibility, to find a logical explanation. An escape from a federal prison? It would be all over the news. A secret twin brother? DeMarcus's family was small and close-knit. Such a secret was unthinkable. A doppelganger? A one-in-a-billion coincidence where a man who was a perfect replica of her husband happened to live in the same city. In a wealthy suburb she just happened to be sent to? The odds were astronomical. The universe wasn't that cruel. Or was it? As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through her blinds, exhaustion gave way to a cold, hard resolve. She was not going crazy. What she had seen was real, and she could not spend another day suffocating in this limbo of doubt. Today was her day off, and she wouldn't waste it cowering in her apartment. She would go back to Peachtree Highlands. She had to. She called the nursing home, her voice convincingly hoarse as she reported a sudden fever. The guilt of the lie was a fleeting pang, easily overwhelmed by the burning, all-consuming need for answers. She stood before her small closet and chose her outfit with care. It was the one she saved for visiting DeMarcus, a pair of well-fitting jeans and a soft blue blouse. She looked at her reflection in the cheap mirror. The woman staring back at her was worn down, with dark circles under her eyes, but her jaw was set in a line of determination. DeMarcus used to say he fell in love with her high cheekbones the first time he saw her. The memory, once a source of warmth, now felt like a shard of glass in her heart. The bus ride felt like a journey to another country. The familiar, vibrant chaos of her neighborhood slowly bled away, replaced by the hushed, manicured perfection of the suburbs. With every mile that passed, her heart beat a little faster. She had no concrete plan. What could she possibly say? "Excuse me, you look exactly like my incarcerated husband. Could you please explain that?" The thought was insane, but the need to confront him, to see his reaction, was more powerful than her fear. When she arrived on Oak Street, the silver sedan was gone from the driveway of number 34. A small blessing. Perhaps he had gone to work. But what now? Should she knock on the door and confront the young woman? The thought of it made her stomach clench with anxiety. Toya positioned herself across the street, pretending to be absorbed in her phone, an amateur spy in a land of tranquil hostility. She watched the house, her senses on high alert, waiting for a sign, an opportunity. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour. Just as she was about to abandon her post, the front door opened. The young woman from the day before emerged, the baby balanced expertly on her hip. She locked the door, walked down the pristine stone path, and headed down the sidewalk toward a park visible at the end of the street. This was her chance. Toya followed, keeping a discreet distance, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. In the park, the woman settled the child into a swing, pushing him gently, her soft humming carried on the breeze. Toya found a bench nearby, pulling out her phone again as a prop, but her eyes were locked on the pair. An hour crawled by. Doubt began to creep in. What was she doing? Stalking a random stranger? Just as her resolve began to waver, he appeared. He walked into the park with the easy, commanding presence of a man who belonged there. He was wearing a dark blue suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He looked every bit the successful executive. He walked directly to the woman and child, leaned down to kiss her, and then tickled the baby, who shrieked with laughter. The scene was a dagger to Toya's heart. A perfect, happy family living the life that should have been hers. They began walking back toward their house, a self-contained unit of joy. Toya rose from her bench and followed, a shadow trailing their happiness. She watched them disappear inside house number 34, and a new, reckless certainty took hold. She would not leave. She would wait, no matter how long it took. She would get him alone. She needed answers, and she would tear them from him if she had to. The door opened. She was staring at her husband's face, but the eyes looking back at her held the cold dread of a stranger caught in a lie. His confession, when it came, was more horrific than anything she could have ever imagined. Toya didn't have to wait long. Patience, a virtue she had been forced to master over 5 years of waiting for a man in prison, now served her well. About half an hour after the family had returned from their idyllic walk in the park, a taxi glided to the curb in front of number 34. The young woman emerged with the baby and a large diaper bag, got into the cab, and was driven away. He was alone. This was it. There would be no more second-guessing, no more retreating into the shadows. Toya took a deep, steadying breath. She rehearsed her opening line a dozen times in her head, but every version sounded like the ravings of a mad woman. In the end, she abandoned planning and let a wave of pure, unadulterated resolve carry her forward. She crossed the street, her steps firm and deliberate, walked up the stone pathway, and rang the doorbell. The chime was a bright, cheerful sound that was grotesquely at odds with the storm raging inside her. Her heart was beating so hard, she was sure he could hear it through the thick, solid wood of the door. The door swung open, and there he was. It was DeMarcus's face, DeMarcus's build, DeMarcus's height. But the man before her was a polished, refined version. His hair was cut short and neat, a stark contrast to the dreadlocks DeMarcus had worn before his arrest. His clothes were expensive. His posture exuded a confidence her husband, a humble mechanic, had never possessed. He stared at her, and for a long second, there was nothing but shocked silence. His mask of calm gentility shattered, replaced by raw, undisguised recognition and fear. "Toya," he breathed, and even the voice was a perfect echo of her husband's, deep with a slight familiar rasp. The sound of her name from his lips broke her paralysis. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice low and steady, her arms crossed over her chest in a gesture of defiance. "Because you are not my husband. DeMarcus Jones is in Coleman Federal Prison. I confirmed it myself yesterday." The man's eyes darted around the quiet, pristine street, as if checking for witnesses. In a sudden, swift movement, he grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. He pulled her inside the house, slamming the heavy door behind them, plunging the foyer into a sudden, shadowed silence. The clean, sterile world of the suburbs had vanished, replaced by a suffocating, private darkness. "What the hell are you doing here?" he hissed, his face inches from hers, the refined facade gone, replaced by the panicked snarl of a cornered animal. Toya wrenched her arm from his grasp. "I asked you first," she shot back, her own fear momentarily eclipsed by a surge of white-hot anger. "Who are you, and why do you have my husband's face?" He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound agitation. "Shit," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "This wasn't supposed to happen. You were never supposed to see me. Answer me!" Toya's voice rose, imbued with a steely command that made him take a step back. All right, he said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "My name is Ezekiel Vance. People call me Zeke. I'm DeMarcus's cousin." Toya's brow furrowed. DeMarcus had cousins, but she'd met most of them. None of them looked like this. None of them looked like him. And he had never, ever mentioned a cousin named Ezekiel. "Not surprising you don't know me," Zeke said with a grim, humorless smirk. "We weren't close. My family moved to Chicago when I was a kid. We hadn't seen each other in years. Not until right before the robbery." Toya's blood ran cold. "What robbery?" Zeke hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the lavishly furnished living room. "Look, let's sit down. This is a long story." They moved into the living room, a space straight out of an architectural magazine, with a massive leather sofa and panoramic windows overlooking the manicured backyard. This room, a testament to a life of success and comfort, felt like a stage set for a nightmare. Toya remained standing, refusing to give even the illusion of a civil conversation. "I came back to Atlanta about 6 years ago," Zeke began, his voice low. "I'd gotten into some trouble up in Chicago, legal trouble. I needed a place to lay low, to start over. DeMarcus, he helped me." "DeMarcus helped you?" The idea was incredulous. "Yeah, you know how he is. Always been a soft touch. He let me stay with you guys for a few days. You remember? You were working the night shift." Vaguely she did. A shadowy relative who had slept on their couch for a weekend. A presence she'd barely registered. "We came up with a plan," Zeke continued, his gaze finally meeting hers. A plan to rob that gas station. The ground beneath Toya's feet seemed to dissolve. What? DeMarcus would never. You're right, Zeke cut her off, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He would never. That's why he didn't go. He took a deep, shaky breath. I did. The truth was out, a poison released into the air. But instead of remorse, the imposter revealed the true face of a devil. He delivered a threat that froze the blood in Toya's veins. Her silence, or her husband's life. You're telling me my husband is in prison for a crime you committed? The question was a whisper, each word a painful stone in her throat. She sank onto the edge of the plush leather sofa, her legs no longer able to support her. The opulent living room, with its clean lines and expensive art, felt like it was closing in on her, its beauty a grotesque mockery of the ugly truth being revealed. Zeke nodded, his gaze fixed on the expensive rug at his feet. He couldn't look at her. He took the fall for me. I already had a record in Illinois, a bad one. If I got picked up for armed robbery, it was life. No parole. He was clean. He thought he'd get a lighter sentence. A few years, maybe. He never expected 15. 15 years. Toya leaped to her feet, the number exploding from her. He lost 5 years of his life, and he's facing 10 more, because of you. I know, Zeke said, holding his hands up again. I know, and I feel terrible about it. I promised him I'd take care of you, and his mom. Take care of us? Toya let out a laugh, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed in the pristine room. You vanished. You disappeared off the face of the earth. His mother died of cancer, and I'm working myself to the bone, barely making ends meet, living in a shoebox apartment while you're living here. She gestured wildly around the room, at the art on the walls, the high-end electronics. This world of comfort was built on the foundation of her suffering. I know, Zeke said, his head bowed. I panicked. I thought the cops would figure it out, that they'd come for me next. I ran, Houston, then Dallas. I didn't come back to Atlanta until a year ago. By then, I'd met Shaniqua. We had the baby on the way. Oh, and you introduced yourself to her as DeMarcus Jones. Toya finished, the pieces of the sickening puzzle clicking into place. Yes, Zeke admitted, his voice barely audible. I used his name, his clean record, his social security number. With my past, I couldn't even get a job at a car wash. But with DeMarcus's history, I was a golden boy. I got a job in the loan department at a major bank. Good title, great pay. You didn't just steal his freedom, Toya said, her voice dripping with a contempt so profound it was almost a physical force. You stole his entire life, his name, his very identity. The man before her wore the face of the man she loved, but he was a parasite, a hollow creature who had devoured his cousin's life to build his own. She looked at him, and in that moment, something in Zeke's demeanor shifted. The performance of shame and remorse evaporated. His shoulders straightened, his chin lifted, and the expression in his eyes turned from fearful to cold, hard, and calculating. The mask had dropped. So, what are you going to do, Toya? He asked, his voice suddenly quiet and dangerous. Go to the police and tell them what? That your husband, who confessed in open court, is actually innocent because his long-lost cousin, who looks just like him, says so? You have any proof? Any evidence at all? Toya stood frozen. He was right. It was her word, the word of a poor black woman from the South Side, against a legal confession and the comfortable, respectable life he had built. She had nothing. I can tell your wife, she managed, her last desperate gambit. I can tell Shaniqua who you really are. Zeke's face contorted into a snarl of pure fury. He took a menacing step toward her, and she instinctively backed away. You will not go anywhere near Shaniqua or my son, he hissed, his voice a low threat. If you ruin this for me, I will ruin you. You think DeMarcus has it easy in there? I can make it a living hell for him. I have connections. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his movements quick and deliberate. He tapped the screen and held it up for her to see. It was a picture, clearly taken recently and inside a prison. It was DeMarcus, sitting at a table in the cafeteria, looking thin and weary. Standing behind him, with a hand on his shoulder, was another inmate, a massive man with a face full of jagged scars and dead eyes. "I have a friend who works as a guard at Coleman," Zeke said, his lips curling into a triumphant sneer. "He keeps an eye on DeMarcus for me, in a friendly way for now. But that can change with one phone call, a shiv in the yard, a convenient accident in the laundry room. These things happen." Toya felt the blood drain from her face. He had thought of everything. He had built a fortress of lies and armed it with the most vicious threat imaginable. He had turned her love for DeMarcus into a weapon against her. He put the phone away. "So you're going to walk out of this house, Toya. You're going to go back to your life and forget you ever saw me. Everyone will be better off." "Better off?" she choked out. "My husband rots in prison for your crime, and you live his life. How is that better?" "That was his choice," Zeke said, his voice as cold and hard as granite. "He chose to protect me. He's a good man. Don't make his sacrifice be for nothing." He walked to the door and opened it, a gesture of finality. "Go," he said, "for DeMarcus's sake, and for your own." Driven into a corner, her hope extinguished by a vile threat, Toya decided on one last, desperate act. But as she approached the house under the cover of darkness, a blood-curdling scream from within signaled that the night's horror had just begun. Toya stumbled out of the house and onto the perfect sun-drenched street, her mind a maelstrom of rage and terror. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The pristine suburban neighborhood, with its quiet streets and perfectly spaced houses, suddenly felt sinister, its orderliness a fragile veneer over a rotten core. Zeke's threat hung in the air, a poisonous cloud. He had her trapped. If she went to the authorities, she had no proof, and DeMarcus would pay the price. Zeke would orchestrate some accident in the prison yard, and she would be responsible for her husband's death. The thought was paralyzing, a cold dread that seeped into her bones. But the alternative, to walk away, to let this monstrous injustice stand, was just as impossible. To let Zeke continue living a stolen life, raising a family on a foundation of lies, while her noble, loving DeMarcus wasted away in a concrete box, it was a betrayal of everything they had ever been to each other. And what about Shaniqua? And that innocent baby? They were living with a monster, a man capable of sacrificing his own flesh and blood for his own gain. They were in danger, even if they didn't know it. She deserved to know the truth about the man she shared her bed with. Toya didn't go to the bus stop. Instead, she found a small, sterile coffee shop near the park and sat there for hours, a single cold cup of coffee in front of her. She stared out the window, watching the seamless flow of life in Peachtree Highlands, feeling like a ghost, haunting a world she could see but never touch. The coffee shop was a neutral space, a temporary refuge between the ugly truth of Zeke's house and the lonely reality of her own apartment. She needed a plan. The police were not an option. A direct confrontation had failed, but she could not, would not, do nothing. By late afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, a decision formed in the chaos of her mind. It was a reckless, dangerous plan, but it was the only one she had left. She would not go to the police. She would go to Shaniqua. She would wait for her to be alone, and she would tell her everything. She would show her the picture of the real DeMarcus in his prison uniform, tell her the story, and pray that the woman would believe her. What Shaniqua did with the information would be up to her, but Toya had to plant the seed of truth. Dusk was settling over the neighborhood as Toya returned to Oak Street, the sky bruised with shades of purple and orange. She found a new hiding spot, a large oak tree across the street that offered a perfect shadowed vantage point of house number 34. Zeke's silver sedan was still in the driveway. He was home. She settled in for a long wait, the cool bark of the tree pressing against her back. An hour passed, then another. Lights flicked on inside the house, casting warm, inviting squares of yellow onto the darkening lawn. The street was quiet, wrapped in the deceptive tranquility of wealthy suburbia. The peaceful scene was a stark, infuriating contrast to the turmoil raging inside her. Toya's nerves were stretched taut. Finally, around 9 p.m., a taxi pulled up to the curb. Shaniqua got out, juggling the sleeping baby and her purse. She paid the driver and walked up the path to her front door. Toya held her breath. She waited until Shaniqua had unlocked the door and stepped inside. This was the moment, With Zeke there, it was more dangerous, but maybe that was better. A direct confrontation with both of them. She took a deep breath, ready to step out from behind the tree and cross the street. All thoughts of caution, of plans, of self-preservation evaporated. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline, Toya broke from her cover and sprinted across the empty street toward the house. The front door had been left ajar, in Shaniqua's haste. Toya pushed it open and plunged into the dimly lit foyer. The sounds of hysterical sobbing and a baby's frantic cries led her deeper into the house, toward the kitchen at the back. She rounded the corner and skidded to a halt. The scene before her, a tableau from a nightmare. Shaniqua was pressed against the far wall, her body trembling uncontrollably. She was clutching her now wailing child so tightly he seemed to be part of her. Her other hand was clamped over her mouth, muffling her own terrified sobs. And on the pristine white-tiled floor, in a rapidly expanding pool of dark crimson blood, lay Zeke. His eyes were wide open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling. A single dark hole was punched neatly in the center of his chest. The night exploded in a cacophony of sirens and flashing lights. Toya, who had arrived to expose a lie, now sat in the back of a police cruiser, the prime suspect in a murder investigation. The circle was closing in, tighter and more terrifying than ever before. The quiet, orderly world of Oak Street had become a chaotic blur of red and blue lights painting frantic strokes across the faces of houses and gaping neighbors. Yellow police tape, stark and alien against the manicured lawns, cordoned off number 34. Uniformed officers and forensic technicians in white jumpsuits moved with a grim, practiced efficiency. The scene was a brutal intrusion, a violation of the neighborhood's carefully constructed peace. Toya sat in the back of a patrol car, wrapping her arms around herself to stop the violent trembling. The doors weren't locked, she wasn't yet in custody. But an officer with a tired, impassive face had told her to stay put until the detective arrived. In an adjacent car, Shaniqua was a statue of shock, still clutching her baby, refusing to let a gentle-voiced social worker take him. A black unmarked Ford Explorer pulled up to the curb. A tall woman in a severe but well-tailored pantsuit emerged. She had high cheekbones, sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and an air of authority that instantly commanded the scene. She conferred briefly with a uniformed sergeant, her gaze sweeping over the house, the crowd, and finally, the patrol car where Toya sat. She walked directly toward it. The back door opened. "Detective Isabella Rossi, homicide," she said, her voice calm and level as she slid in beside Toya. The small space was suddenly charged with her presence. "And you, I presume, are LaToya Washington?" Toya could only nod, her throat too tight for words. "I didn't kill him," she whispered, the words finally breaking free. "That's what we're here to find out," Detective Rossi replied, her tone neutral. She pulled out a small notebook and a pen. The way she looked at Toya felt heavy, freighted with unspoken assumptions. A black woman found at a murder scene in an upscale, predominantly white neighborhood. Rossi had seen this script before. "Tell me what happened, from the beginning." Toya took a ragged breath, and the story spilled out. A torrent of impossible truths. She told Rossi everything, seeing the man who looked like DeMarcus, the confrontation, Zeke's confession to the robbery, his life as an imposter, and finally, his chilling threat against her husband in prison. She recounted waiting across the street, hearing the scream, and running in to find the horrific scene. Rossi listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, her pen scratching methodically across the page. The sterile interior of the police car felt a world away from the warm, treacherous living room where she'd confronted Zeke. Here, there was no pretense of comfort, only the cold, hard reality of suspicion. When Toya finished, the detective clicked her pen shut. "So, let me get this straight," Rossi said, her voice laced with a professional skepticism that felt like an accusation. "You're claiming that the deceased Ezekiel Vance was impersonating your husband, who is currently serving time in a federal facility for a crime Vance confessed to you he committed." "Yes. He told me this afternoon, and he threatened me. He threatened to have DeMarcus killed if I went to the police or told his wife." "And what did you do after he threatened you?" Rossi's eyes were sharp, probing. "I left. I went to a coffee shop. But then, I decided I had to warn her. I came back. I waited for her to get home. When she went inside, I heard her scream and I ran in. That's when I saw him. Do you have an alibi, Ms. Washington? For the time between you leaving Mr. Vance's house this afternoon and returning tonight? Toya's heart sank. No, I was at the coffee shop, then I just walked around, thinking. I don't think anyone can confirm that. I see, Rossi said, the two words landing with the weight of a judgment. Ms. Washington, I'm going to have to ask you to accompany me to the station for a more formal interview. It wasn't a request, it was an order. At the downtown precinct, Toya was led into a small, gray interrogation room. It was cold and sterile, with a metal table, 2 chairs, and a large one-way mirror. She knew that on the other side of that mirror, unseen eyes were watching her, analyzing her every move. Detective Rossi entered a few minutes later, carrying a thick file. She laid out a series of glossy, gruesome photos on the table. Zeke, lying in a pool of his own blood. Ezekiel Vance was shot once in the chest, close range, Rossi stated, her voice dispassionate. Medical examiner puts the preliminary time of death between 5 and 7 p.m. The murder weapon, a .38 caliber handgun, is missing. She looked up from the photos, her gaze pinning Toya to the chair. You had a motive, Ms. Washington. A very powerful one. This man, by your own account, destroyed your life and stole your husband's. Any jury in the country would understand that level of rage. I was enraged, Toya admitted, her voice trembling, but I am not a murderer. With no alibi and the strongest motive imaginable, the walls were closing in. As detectives hit a dead end, a specialized officer was brought to the scene, a K9 unit. The dog, an animal with no prejudice, was tasked with finding a scent of truth, a trail that could either lead to the real killer or seal Toya's fate. We'll be testing your hands and clothing for gunshot residue, Detective Rossi stated flatly in the gray interrogation room. Toya agreed without a moment's hesitation, a small, defiant act of a woman with nothing to hide. As an officer led her away for the test, she felt the invisible net around her tighten. Back on Oak Street, the investigation was stalling. The forensic team had been meticulous, but the killer had been, too. There were no usable fingerprints on the door, no foreign fibers, no shell casings. The scene was clean, unnervingly so. The murderer had entered, fired a single fatal shot, and vanished. While Toya was being processed in the cold, bureaucratic world of the police station, a different kind of investigation was beginning in the quiet, humid air of the suburbs. The human element had hit a wall. It was time for the instinctual. Get K9 over there, Rossi commanded into her radio, her voice sharp with frustration. I want them to sweep the entire property and the street. The killer didn't just evaporate. A short time later, a specialized K9 SUV arrived. The handler, a serious, focused officer named Miller, led out a magnificent German shepherd. The dog's name was Shadow, and he moved with a quiet, confident energy, his intelligent eyes taking in the chaotic scene. Miller brought Shadow into the house, allowing him to get the scent from an article of Zeke's clothing. Find him, boy, Miller murmured, giving the command. Shadow's demeanor changed instantly. He became a creature of pure purpose. His nose dropped to the floor, and he began to work, moving in a zigzag pattern, his powerful body low to the ground. He tracked a path from the body in the kitchen, through the living room, and out the still-ajar front door. On the porch, he paused, circling twice before picking up the scent again, leading Officer Miller down the stone path. The detectives watched, holding their breath. This was the moment of truth. Would the dog lead them to the oak tree where Toya admitted she had been hiding? If he did, her story would crumble. It would look like she had lied, that she had been much closer to the house, perhaps even inside, when the shot was fired. But Shadow didn't turn toward the tree. He continued straight, past the manicured lawn to the edge of the street. There, at the curb, he stopped. He sniffed the asphalt intently, circled the spot 3 times, and then sat down, looking up at Miller with a soft whine. The trail was dead. He lost the scent right here at the road, Miller announced to the other officers. Whoever it was, they got into a vehicle right at this spot. They were waiting for him, or he was waiting for them. Back at the precinct, the night wore on. Shaniqua, having been cleared to leave and now staying with a neighbor, had been brought back for a formal statement. In a move that surprised Toya, Rossi brought Shaniqua into the interrogation room where she was being held. "Ms. Parker has agreed to speak with you in my presence," Rossi explained. "I believe you two have things to discuss." Shaniqua looked at Toya, her eyes red and swollen, a maelstrom of confusion, grief, and fear. "You said his real name was Ezekiel?" she asked, her voice fragile. Toya nodded gently. "Yes, my husband, the real DeMarcus Jones, is in prison. The man you knew was his cousin." She told the story again, this time with a profound sadness for the woman in front of her, another victim of Zeke's lies. "I didn't know," Shaniqua wept. "He told me his whole family died in a car crash years ago, that he was all alone." "Ms. Parker," Detective Rossi interjected, her tone softer now. "Did he seem worried lately? Any trouble? Money problems?" Shaniqua hesitated, wiping her tears. "He was tense, always on his phone, whispering. I overheard him once, a few days ago. He was arguing with someone, begging for more time. He said he'd have the money soon." "Money?" Rossi leaned forward. "Did he owe someone a lot of money?" "I don't know," Shaniqua shook her head. "He never talked to me about finances. We always seemed to have plenty." Rossi made a note. "Does the name Leroy Jenkins mean anything to you?" Shaniqua and Toya both shook their heads. The name was foreign to them. Rossi nodded as if expecting the answer. For Toya, the dog's behavior was a tiny spark of hope. It hadn't implicated her, but it hadn't exonerated her either. The scent had vanished into thin air, leaving her stranded in a purgatory of suspicion. A negative residue test and a grainy surveillance video changed everything. Toya was finally cleared, but her personal victory only served to ignite a new, more daunting battle, the fight to reclaim a life for the husband the justice system had forgotten. The door to the interrogation room opened again, what felt like an eternity later. Toya looked up, her body tense with anticipation. Detective Rossi walked in, her expression unreadable. She sat down and was silent for a long moment, studying Toya's face. The stark gray room felt like a vacuum, a space where futures were decided in quiet, deliberate moments like this one. Toya had been existing in this gray limbo for hours, a suspect in a world that had already judged her once before. "Good news, Ms. Washington," Rossi finally said, and the words caused Toya to release a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "The gunshot residue test came back negative. Your hands, your clothes, all clean." A wave of relief so profound it was dizzying washed over Toya. It was the first piece of concrete evidence in her favor, a small crack of light in the suffocating darkness. "There's more," Rossi continued, opening a file. "We pulled the surveillance footage from the ATM at the bank across the street from Vance's house. The camera angle is wide. At 6:35 p.m., it caught a car pulling up to the curb, right where the K9 lost the scent." She turned a laptop around to show Toya. The footage was grainy, the lighting poor, but it was clear enough. A beat-up dark gray sedan had pulled up. A large, powerfully built man got out, looked around, and then walked purposefully toward Zeke's house. "This man," Rossi said, pausing the video on a blurry profile shot, "has been identified as Leroy the Hammer Jenkins. He's a well-known and very dangerous loan shark operating out of the city. He was inside the house for approximately 15 minutes, then is seen exiting in a hurry and speeding away. The timing fits perfectly with the ME's estimated time of death." Toya stared at the screen, at the face of the man who had almost certainly murdered Zeke. "So, I can go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Almost," Rossi said, closing the laptop. Her demeanor had changed completely. The hard edge of the interrogator was gone, replaced by the focused curiosity of a puzzle solver. "We ran a full background check on Ezekiel Vance. You were telling the truth. He has a significant criminal record in Illinois for fraud and forgery, and he is indeed DeMarcus Jones's first cousin." She paused, then pushed a printed photograph across the table. It was a mugshot of DeMarcus from his arrest 5 years ago. "We contacted Coleman Federal. They confirmed your husband is in their custody. Is this him?" Toya looked down at the image of the young, terrified man who was her husband. His eyes were wide with a fear she remembered all too well. Tears welled in her own eyes as she nodded. "Yes, that's him." "The resemblance is uncanny," Rossi remarked, shaking her head slightly. And it bothers me. The story you told me, about your husband taking the fall for Vance's crime. We can't prove it. DeMarcus Jones confessed. The evidence at the time was considered sufficient. But you know now what Zeke was capable of, Toya pleaded. He stole a man's entire life. A robbery is nothing to someone like that. I know, Rossi agreed, her expression serious. And I'll be honest with you, Ms. Washington, something about that old case file stinks. The witness identification was shaky, and the fingerprint evidence was dismissed as inconclusive, but not negative. In the rush to close the case, with a confession in hand, nobody looked any deeper. The system doesn't like to question a confession, especially from a black man with a public defender. The quiet acknowledgement of that ugly truth, coming from this powerful white detective, was startling. It was a bridge across the chasm of mistrust that had defined Toya's interactions with the law. It was a flicker of hope. I can't make you any promises, Rossi said, her gaze direct and sincere. Reopening a closed case, overturning a conviction, it's a legal mountain to climb, but I promise you this, I will look into it. I will personally review every piece of evidence from that robbery 5 years ago. If there's a thread to pull, I will pull it. She closed the file. You're free to go, Ms. Washington, but don't leave Atlanta. You're a material witness in a murder investigation now. Walking out of the police precinct into the cool, pre-dawn air felt surreal. Toya took a deep breath, the city air tasting of freedom. She had walked into that station a murder suspect, her life hanging by a thread. She was walking out a free woman, but also a woman with a new formidable mission. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. A 9-hour bus ride brought Toya to the cold, iron gates of the federal prison. Behind them was the man she loved, a man who had sacrificed 5 years of his life for a lie. This reunion would not be an ending, but the true beginning of their fight for a future. In the week that followed, Toya's life was a blur of phone calls and anxious waiting. Leroy, the Hammer Jenkins, was apprehended in a rundown motel on the south side of Atlanta. Faced with the surveillance evidence, he confessed to killing Ezekiel Vance over a massive gambling debt. The murder case was closed, but for Toya, the most important case was just opening. Detective Rossi was true to her word. She had assigned a cold case detective from her unit to officially review the 2018 gas station robbery. They were re-interviewing the original witnesses, whose memories had now faded, and more importantly, they were submitting the original, inconclusive fingerprint evidence for reanalysis using modern, more sophisticated technology. Hope, a feeling Toya had suppressed for 5 long years, began to bloom, fragile but persistent in her chest. She couldn't wait for the results. She needed to see DeMarcus. She needed to tell him everything, to look him in the eye, and let him know that the truth was finally coming out. She scraped together what little money she had and bought a one-way ticket on a Greyhound bus to Florida. The 9-hour journey was an ordeal of cramped seats and the smell of stale air, but Toya barely noticed. Her mind was racing, replaying the conversation she was about to have, wondering how he would react to the news of his cousin's life and death, and the impossible possibility of his own freedom. Coleman Federal Correctional Institution was an imposing, soulless complex of gray concrete and gleaming razor wire, baking under the relentless Florida sun. It was the physical embodiment of the injustice that had consumed their lives. After navigating the labyrinthine check-in process, the metal detectors, the pat-downs, the surrendering of her personal belongings, she was led into the visitation room. It was a large, loud hall filled with rows of small tables, a place of forced smiles and whispered conversations, all under the watchful eyes of stone-faced guards. This room was a world of contained misery, a stark contrast to the life of freedom Zeke had been living. She sat at her assigned table, her hands trembling in her lap. After what felt like an eternity, a door on the far side of the room opened, and DeMarcus walked in. He was thinner than she remembered, the prison jumpsuit hanging loosely on his frame. His hair was cut short, his face etched with a weariness that hadn't been there 5 years ago. But when he saw her, his face broke into the same wide, genuine smile that had first captured her heart. It was like the sun breaking through a storm cloud. "Toya," he said, his voice thick with emotion, as he reached their table and pulled her into a hug as best he could across the fixed furniture. "It's so good to see you." She clung to him, burying her face in his shoulder, the familiar scent of him mixed with the institutional smell of soap and starch. "You too, Dee," she whispered, a lump forming in her throat. "I have so much to tell you." They sat down, and he took her hands in his grip warm and strong. "What is it? You look different." Worried, but something else too. Toya took a deep breath and began to tell him the whole impossible story. She told him about the shift in Peachtree Highlands, about seeing Zeke, about the confrontation and his confession. She told him about Shaniqua and the baby, about the threats against his life, and finally, about Zeke's murder. DeMarcus listened, his expression shifting from utter disbelief to shock, and finally, to a deep, profound sadness. "Zeke is dead?" he repeated, shaking his head slowly as if trying to clear it. "And he was really pretending to be me all this time?" "Yes," Toya confirmed. "But Dee, there's good news. The police in Atlanta, they're reopening your case. A detective. She believes me. She found inconsistencies. They think they might be able to prove you're innocent." DeMarcus stared at her, his mind struggling to process the sheer weight of it all. "I don't know what to say. I never thought he would do something like this. I thought I was helping him get a second chance." "Did you really do it, Dee?" Toya asked softly, needing to hear it from him one last time. "Did you take the fall for him?" He nodded, a bitter, self-deprecating chuckle escaping his lips. "Yeah, he was desperate, crying. Said he was facing life because of his record. He swore he'd take care of you and Mom. He swore it." He looked down at his hands on the table. "I was so naive." No," Toya said, squeezing his hands fiercely. "You were kind. You have a good heart. It's the best thing about you." "And look where it got me," he said, gesturing around the bleak, noisy room. "It's going to get you home," Toya said, her voice filled with a conviction she hadn't felt in years. "You're coming home, DeMarcus. I believe it. And I am not going to stop fighting until you do." For the first time in 5 years, she saw a flicker of real hope in his eyes. Just then, a guard announced that visiting hours were ending. They stood and embraced one last time. "I love you, Toya," he whispered into her ear. "Always have." "I love you too," she replied, "and I'll wait, no matter how long it takes." As she boarded the bus back to Atlanta, Toya felt a strange mix of sorrow and strength. The journey ahead was daunting. It would take another 8 months of legal battles, propelled by Detective Rossi's findings and a relentless pro bono lawyer Toya found, before DeMarcus's conviction was finally overturned. The day he walked out of prison, a free man, but not an unmarked one, was the first day of the rest of their lives. Their story is a harsh lesson in the fragility of justice and the insidious nature of systemic bias. It's a testament to the fact that goodness can be cruelly exploited, and that trust, once broken, leaves the deepest scar. But more than anything, the story of LaToya and DeMarcus is a powerful reminder of resilience. It teaches that true justice isn't always given. Sometimes it must be clawed back from the darkness, piece by painful piece. It shows that in a world of lies, one person's unwavering belief and ferocious love can be the most powerful force for truth there is.